I'm Megan. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Alberta, and I'm going to be talking today about the capabilities of a literary hypertext tool called Twine. And this tutorial is called twinery.org, Building Literary Hypertexts. So I'm going to start with part one, and this is an introduction to literary hypertext. So let's start with what literary hypertext is. So it's a form of digital story writing that calls on the reader to participate in the narrative's unfolding by selecting various hyperlink options, which branch the narrative into nonlinear directions. And a lot of the scholarly work on literary hypertext is concentrated in the discipline of game studies and digital humanities. And its primary function has typically been looking at it as a tool to make digital fictions. And digital fictions are literary story games that use hyperlinks to create a choose-your-own-adventure style experience for the reader. So this is the twinery.org interface, and Twine is one platform for creating literary hypertext, and it's a freely accessible open source tool. It was developed by interactive fiction author Chris Klimas in 2009 to reduce barriers to entry for game creators of marginalized identities. And Twine has come to be described by scholars as this predominantly queer and women-dominated community. And Twine has cultivated a movement of support from marginalized game developers who were often excluded from these very masculinist and white spaces of hypertext and game development. And this is because Twine is a culture of free production and distribution. So it's free to download, it's open source, and it exports stories as HTML files where authors can publish them online for free. And it's also very easy to use. So there's no coding knowledge, so the author doesn't have to have any of that kind of prior software experience. But it does utilize variables and conditional logic, images, CSS, JavaScript, and other capabilities for authors who are maybe more experienced. And these elements allow the integration of sound and images and interactive components. But beyond technological and financial access, Twine and literary hypertext as a whole really subverts assumed norms in typical story writing because it promotes experimentation through multiple endings, branching plot, and interactive components. So reader players, is what they're called, can experience the story differently, and they can really play out different endings or different narrative paths. And the unique capability of writing stories in Twine is really twofold. So it comes down to interactivity for the reader and branching plot lines. And although I'll stress that not all stories built in Twine have these structures, but they can. And so I just want to take a look at a tutorial that I built for participants in my dissertation research, which I'll get into more later in the tutorial. And I just want to show how these features can really be used. So first, I'm going to take a look here. So this is a module that I created for my dissertation research that participants are using. And this is an example of interactivity that I coded into the Twine module. So you see here, it asks you to enter your name. So I'll enter my name. Press OK. Great, let's get going. And then it says, hi, Megan. So it pulls the data that was put in the prior passage, and it pulls it up here. So this is an example of interactivity, a very basic example. But it can also be very rhizomatic, and it can be used to imagine sort of alternative plot lines or offer multiple endings. And it's essentially about choice for the reader. So where is the reader going to click next? And another example that I included in my Twine module that I made, we can look at here. So when I say nonlinear, I'll show you what I mean. We click. So once upon a time, O was walking through the woods. Suddenly, they come across a fork in the path ahead. So which way do you turn? Left or right? So if we choose right, your walk is sunny and warm, you pick raspberries and you eat them from the bush. So you can see the images and you can hear the sound. But what happens if we went left? So let's turn around and go left. So it begins to storm above as heavy rain falls around your feet. You notice the path beginning to flood. And then we move on. So ultimately, building a story in Twine can be about choice. So also what we can do in Twine when we're thinking about structure is we can break it down into 3 separate paths. So if we look first at the forward path, the story moves the author through a straight line. So the intention of a forward path is that every reader will have the exact same experience with the story. And in the Twine interface, we'll see that the forward path looks something like this. So A moves to B, moves to C, moves to D, moves to E. But we can also do something called a weaving path. So the story branches out with different hypertext passages, but ultimately it comes back to a single path. So in the Twine interface, a weaving path could look something like this. So we have A moves to B, but all of a sudden in the B passage, you have 2 hypertext options. You have C or D, and this can move you in a different path. And you can come back together in these passages to E if you like. So the purpose of the weaving path could be to create the illusion of choice for the reader player, but ultimately, as author, you're still holding on to control for how the story plot plays out. And finally, we have multiple paths. So the story has different paths for the reader to follow. Each path has a different plot and possibly a different ending to the story. Multiple paths are more complex to make and they take a little bit more time, but they've come to be understood as sort of the heart of literary hypertext. And then the purpose of multiple paths is to offer agency to the reader player. So we see at the beginning from passage A, there are 3 hypertext options that branch the plot into 3 directions. And from here, 1, 2, 3, they may never converge again for the entire story, or they might. But this gives you the option of having multiple paths to follow. So in this presentation, I'm going to offer a quick tutorial on how to use Twine, and then I'm going to discuss 3 different potential uses for the tool. So its most typical use in the creation of digital fiction games. Then I'm going to talk about using it for educational purposes, specifically for mind mapping. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about my dissertation research and using Twine as a therapy tool for writing illness narratives. And thanks for listening, and I'll see you in part 2. Hi. So this is part 2 of Twinery.org, Building Literary Hypertexts. And the second section is called a mini Twine tutorial. So this is for very beginners learning how to use Twine. And in this section, I'm going to offer a step-by-step guide on how to build a very basic story in Twine. Great, so the first thing we're going to do is open up a new browser. And Chrome works best for Twine, but really any browser is fine. And we're going to type in twinery.org. And then this is Twine's homepage. So here you can find tutorials on Twine, a selection of Twine works here in the middle if you scroll down. And then also there's a Twine wiki that can show you different codes that you can use, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after. But what we want to do is click on Use It Online. And Twine can be downloaded to your computer and you can use it offline, but for now we're just going to use it in the browser. So if you have multiple Twine projects going, here is where you're going to be able to view them all. So I have 0 stories right now. So what I want to do is I'm going to click the plus story button. So it asks us, what should your story be named? And you can change this later. So we're going to give our story a name. We'll call it My First Story. And then we click Add. Great. So this is the Twine interface. So this is where we will build the bones of our Twine story. What we want to do next is click on this upward facing arrow that has our Twine story name. And I'm just gonna have to move myself. There we go. Let's move me over here. Okay, and then what we want to do now is change story format. So the story format controls the appearance and the behavior of your story. So if we're using SugarCube, for example, this is one version of a JavaScript library. But for this tutorial, we're going to make sure Harlow 3.1.0 is selected. So it is. And there are obviously other story formats here that you can use, but for this workshop, we're going to use the latest version of Harlow. So we'll click out of there. That's fine. Great. So you see the box in the middle of our screen that says Untitled Passage here. This box is called a passage. And we're going to double click on the Untitled Passage. Great. So this is going to be where our opening passage of our story starts. And we can change the name of this passage by highlighting the Untitled Passage and then typing in our own title. So I'm going to call it Opening Passage. Now you can see the text below here that says double click this passage to edit. We're going to double click this. Great. And now we can type in the opening text of our story. So since we're just practicing right now, feel free to type in whatever you like. I'm going to start with this. So let's say I woke up night. So I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of a crash, right in the middle of the action. So the bullet points, they'll actually be, that we see here, they'll actually be invisible when we publish the story. They only appear when we edit passages to help keep our text organized. So you don't have to worry about them now. So now that we created our first passage, we want to test it and see how it will look when the story is published. So to do that, we're going to exit this and go to the bottom where we see the bug here. We're going to press test. All of a sudden, a new browser tab should pop up that shows us how our passage will look when the story is published. So I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of a crash. Great. So we can exit this for now. We're back. So now I think we should create some hypertext links. So in Twine, hypertext links are highlighted text that bring you to the next passage in the story. So we want to double click our opening passage. And then now for some very basic coding. To create a hyperlink text, all you have to do is enclose the text you want to be the link in double square brackets. So you can add as many hypertext links as you'd like in a single passage. And each one will create a new link. And I'll show you what I mean. So for the opening passage of my story here, I'm going to add 3. So I lay frozen in my bed, or shine light. And then our last link. Okay. So I lay frozen in my bed. That will be option 1. I shine my iPhone light at the bedroom floor. Option 2. Or I get up and begin to walk down the hall. Option 3. So let's see what this does. We're going to click on the X. And now we should see 3 new passages appear, branching from our original opening passage. And the title of each new passage is the text we included as our hypertext links in the opening passage. So we can see that the title in bolded here is what we wrote. So let's test these passages out. So we'll press the bug. So a new browser pops up for us, and this reflects the changes that we made. So I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a crash. Which option are we going to pick? We click on one. So it'll show that we haven't actually added any content from here, but it works, so that's good. So we can exit that. And then just a couple more notes on hypertext. So a passage is linked to by enclosing that passage's name in double square brackets. For example, if I brought my reader through many passages, but I want to link the reader back to our very first passage, all I have to do is write in double square brackets opening passage. So if we start here and we do, and it'll give me the option, it'll pop up, click it, exit. So we see that the arrow now goes both ways. So this will link us back to our opening passage. But sometimes we want to link to a specific passage, but we don't want the hypertext in our story to show as that passage's name. So in this case, you can choose whatever text that you want and then enclose it in square brackets. And then after the text we want to include in the story, we include 2 symbols. So the hyphen and then the greater than sign. And then we follow that by the actual passage's name. So we test it out here. We would do, whatever text I want, and then the hyphen, greater than sign, and then opening passage. So we see that this is actually the passage that's linked, the opening passage. If we exit, we see that it still works. But if we play it or we test it out, it just shows whatever text I want. That brings us back to the opening passage. Great. So now for the most important skill of all, which is saving your story. So since we're building our story in our browser, it's important that we save our story regularly. So we want to do that by, just move me out of the way. So we click on our story name at the bottom here, and then we click Publish to File. And this is going to save our story as an HTML file in the Downloads folder of our computer. But because it's an HTML file, we'll need to publish it somewhere on the internet in order to share it with people. So what I can do is when I double click on this story, it will open again for me in the browser, but I won't be able to send this to anyone to play. What I'll need to do is publish it. And there's lots of different options for where you can publish Twine stories online, but my favorite is a place called itch.io. So it's a website, and it's mainly used for hosting indie games and Twine games, but they make the process for uploading extremely easy, and they're also free, so that's who I recommend. And then I'd advise you to not continue working on your Twine story until you feel comfortable saving and uploading it again to work on. And so if you want to leave your story partway through building it and then you want to come back at a later time, all we have to do is what we did. So we published it to file. And if we want to come back, we'll go twinery.org. And when we click Use It Online, our browser should save our story. So it'll appear here in the inventory, and we can see it right here. But if there is, for some reason, your story is not there, there's no need to worry. All you have to do is click Import from File, choose File, and in our downloads, it's here, Open. And it's asking us if we want to replace it. We'll say don't replace it, and we have 2 here. Great. So what I haven't talked about yet is style. So There's many stylistic elements that we can add to our Twine stories, but for this tutorial, we can look at some of the basics, and this includes changing text features like italics and bold, and changing where the text appears on the screen. So I'm going to just very briefly show some different codes that we can use. So these are codes for bold text, for italic bold, and for underlining our text. So can show you how it works. So if we try with bold, go into my story. So if I want the first statement here to be bold, I can try here. And then we test it out. And it's emboldened. And other things we can do is also change the size of the text in the passage. So these are different codes that we can use for that. And it's using the hash or the hashtag symbol in front of the text that we want to enlarge. And these are different heading levels. So using one hash makes it the largest text possible, so heading level 1. And then adding more hash from there, or hashtags, can make the text smaller down to heading level 4. So to see what that looks like, go into our passage. So if we don't want this bold anymore, and we want to make it quite large, we can make it heading level 1. See what that looks like. So it's quite big. Great. And then lastly, alignment. So alignment changes where the text appears on screen in the passage. And there's a bunch of different codes that we can use for that. So we can do right alignment, we can do centered, we can do left alignment, which is the norm way that it is presented. So if you don't include any alignment codes, then it'll be left aligned. And we can also do columns. So we can do left column, middle column, right column. And how alignment codes work is that you have to place the text that you want to be affected by the code below that code on the next line. And the alignment code will affect all text underneath it until a new code is put into place. So I can show you how that looks. If we go here, so if we want all this text to be, let's say, right aligned, I have to put it above it. That's the right aligned code. And we'll test it out. So there, it's all right aligned now. So I went through these codes very quickly, but you can find them online at a bunch of different places, but a place that I really enjoy going to is the Twinery.org wiki page. And this includes endless amount of information on different codes that you can use and changing the color of the text and the background color, adding images, adding sounds, and all these different features that you can do. So this is where I recommend to get your information from. And believe it or not, you now actually have all the tools that you need to write a basic Twine story. So thank you for sticking with me. And in the next part, I'm going to talk about different uses for Twine, and I'm going to start with games. So see you there. So welcome to the third section of this tutorial called Twinery.org, Building Literary Hypertext. And this third section, I'm going to discuss one of the more prominent uses for Twine, which is creating literary digital games. So games created in Twine are referred to in the literature by a couple of different names. So we have literary hypertext, which places an emphasis on the textual aspects of the tool. Or we also have digital fictions, which emphasizes the storytelling capabilities. But the transformative potential for Twine games really became recognized when a scholar and game designer named Anna Anthropy wrote about the tool, referring to it as a Twine revolution. And what she argued was that there was undeniably multiple barriers to access for game creators of marginalized identities, and Twine was breaking open these barriers. And it was doing this because, as I talked about in the first section, Twine is a culture of free production and distribution. So Twine is free to download. It publishes files directly to HTML, where you can publish on the internet for free. And it's easy to use. It doesn't require any coding knowledge by the user, etc. So because of this, people who have traditionally been pushed to the margins of game development are now populating the Twine community in masses. So Twine has been referred to by scholars as a predominantly women and queer-dominated space, as I mentioned before. But beyond technological and financial access, Twine and literary hypertext as a whole really subverts assumed norms in typical games. And for example, we can see that Twine has been written about as a space where queer characters are able to flourish and thrive. And this is in contrast to a very harmful trope in games and other media where queer characters are killed off and prevented from living out full character arcs. And a large part of this is because queer authors are writing stories in Twine without some of those typical barriers. So I want to have a look at some games and explore the kinds of possibilities and dynamic structure that these games can take. So the first one we're going to look at, this is a screenshot from Queers in Love at the End of the World by Anna Anthropy. And this is a really popular Twine game. And how it works is, as the reader player, you have 10 seconds to choose how you want to interact with your lover before the whole world is wiped away. So we can see in the top corner that this is a countdown clock. When we actually play the game, we can look out here, try begin. So we see the clock going. You really don't have time to read. You're clicking away. Everything is wiped away. So essentially it's the feeling of imminent danger, and it's manifested in the fact that you don't have time to read through the pages. And it's a really beautiful game to play, so I recommend it. And then another really interesting game that I love that really shows how dynamic Twine can be is called The Tiniest Room by Eric108. So if we look at this game, it's essentially a virtual escape room. And as the reader player, you're introduced to this scenario in the beginning here that you're locked in a room that you need to escape from. So we can try to go through a little bit. So if we look down, there's floor safe. Try the combination. I don't know, we're just putting in numbers. Wrong combination. Retry. Okay, we don't know what it is. So we realize now that we kind of have to explore the other options at the beginning that we had. But go back. So we really need to explore these options in order to figure out what the combination is. And what's interesting about The Tiniest Room is that it shows how new options can be unlocked in a passage depending on where you've been before in the game. And I don't want to give away too much, so I'll just leave it there. So these two games, Queers in Love at the End of the World and The Tiniest Room, really showcase how Twine can be heavily textual, but Twine can also incorporate images and sound. So we look here. This is The Temple of No by Crows. So this is a very popular comedic Twine game that does an incredible job at incorporating sound and image. So it's a short interactive narrative experience where you go on this adventure and you have to choose if you're going to play as either a woman, a bloke, or a frog. So these are the options here. So if we go and we look, we can turn on the sound. So pick a woman. You can read through the text, turn page, the story goes on. Goes on, keep going. We see images, new images, new sounds. So Temple of No is very fun. and it's interactive, and it shows how a Twine game can be created through multimodal storytelling. So this has been a very short peek into what Twine games can look like, so thank you so much for listening. And in the next section, I'm going to talk about other more novel uses for Twine. So using Twine for educational purposes and mind mapping, and also using it to write illness narratives. So I'll see you there. So welcome to the fourth section of this tutorial called Twinery.org, Building Literary Hypertexts. And in this section, I'm going to discuss one of the more non-conventional uses for Twine, and that's as an educational tool, so specifically for mind mapping. So there's a lot of digital mind mapping tools out there that we know, but what Twine does that's different is that you can build interactive maps and create links through concepts and ideas. So similar not to just a Wikipedia page, not a single Wikipedia page, but as the Wikipedia interface as a whole, you can build mini wiki-type databases on a topic of your choosing. And what I'm going to showcase today is a large-scale project that I built for the purposes of studying for my comprehensive exams, and I wrote those last year. So at my institution, PhD students have something called a comprehensive exam, and we spend around half a year reading 70 to 100 texts in our field, and we have to relate those to our dissertation topic, and then we write an exam. And our committee puts together a series of essay questions relating to those readings. So we have around 7 days to write 7 essay questions, and they have to be 3 to 5 pages each. So the comprehensive exam is very well known for being stressful. It's a very stressful exercise for PhD students, especially because preparing for an exam like this is very complicated. So we don't know what questions we're going to get until the day of the exam. So in preparation for my exam, I spent months reading texts, and I built around a 200-page Word document of notes. So for each text, I would summarize its key arguments, I would document some key quotes, I would brainstorm keywords, and then I would note what other texts or scholars this piece was linked to. So I got to a few months before my exam with this 200-page Word document that was essentially useless. So I couldn't see where the connections were. I could only engage with texts in isolation, and I was really missing those, those bigger picture conceptualizations of the theoretical frameworks that were threading throughout the work. So I knew that I was in trouble and that I needed a different approach to study. So at that time, I was actually working with Twine in another project with participants who were writing stories, and I thought to myself, I could translate my 200-page Word document into a Twine database, and I could spend the next couple of months making those connections between texts using hyperlinks. So that's kind of exactly what I did. And I just want to give a very broad overview of this database that I built. So when you take a look, okay, so this is the Twine interface, and this is the bones of the database that I built. So you can see here that the connections that I built between my texts, there's so many of them. So it looks kind of like a spider web. So this just shows me in retrospect kind of everything that I was missing using a linear stagnant document. So you see, you just move around. So all these lines are different connections that I made. You can see how far they go. Yeah, so there's a lot. So as you can tell, this is very intricate, but it's not very helpful to read the database in the interface format like this because we don't know what's going on. There's too many lines. So I'll show you how I organized it and essentially how to read the database. So why don't we'll start here and we'll play from here. these are the 4 different topics that I divided my text into. So these are the 3 mega topics that are related to my dissertation. So if we click on medical humanities here, so these are all the texts that I have categorized under medical humanities. So what I did is I hyperlinked each text name. So if we choose one at random, let's say G. Thomas Kouser. So this is a chapter from his Vulnerable Subjects book, Ethics in Life Writing. So we'll click on it. So here are the notes that I created about this text, and we have my summaries of the key points up here, from here. Then we have quotes that I found helpful down here, and then we have the key terms that I pulled out. But what's important here is what I chose to be the hyperlink. So we have 2 different categories that I made. I have hyperlinked terms that are important to my research and to the theory. So for example, we have biomedical ethics, principalism, disability, things like that. So for example, if I click on biomedical ethics, I have a passage that I made that includes a definition of bioethics, as well as a list of other texts that engage with this concept. So we see here. So if I click on any of these texts to read about them, these are all other texts on my reading list that deal with the concept of bioethics, and I can see them all in one place, so that's super helpful. I see that these other 3 texts also deal with bioethics. But if we go back, we can see that other hypertext words in this passage are authors' names. So Irvine and Sharon, they're prolific authors in the field of life writing, and I chose to hypertext their names because if I click on them, I can see my summary of their text. And if I scroll to the bottom, here I can see which other texts also reference Irvine and Sharon. So down here. So this is how it sort of becomes a cyclical web. So if we just click through, if I want to look at narrative medicine, my definition and all the texts that deal with narrative medicine, click here. The concept normative, these are texts that deal with normative or normativity, Judith Butler. So we see it's just really, it's like a cycle. So we can just continue to click on a concept or on an author, and it will continuously, it'll tour us around our notes. So both the practice of building this interface and reading through it really helped me map out the larger theoretical frameworks that are underpinning my work. And I passed my exam, so I can attest to this method. So this was a very brief overview on how to use Twine as a mind mapping tool. So I hope this was helpful. And in my last section, I'm going to discuss a very novel use for Twine, which is a topic that I'm developing in my dissertation, and that's using Twine to write illness narratives. So I'll see you there. So I'm going to wrap up this tutorial by discussing briefly using Twine to write illness narratives. So this is a topic that I'm actually working on in my dissertation, and my dissertation research is tentatively called Click Here for Body Stories, Employing Literary Hypertext as a Form of Illness Narrative for Women with Hyperandrogenism. So I'll get into that a little bit more in a second, but first I want to talk about Arthur Frank. So in The Wounded Storyteller, Arthur Frank wrote that major illness has the potential to disrupt the planned destination of our life, and that through the practice of illness narrative, or autobiographical accounts of the experience of illness, the capacity for telling our story is reclaimed. So despite the therapeutic value of traditional illness narratives, the medium has been criticized for upholding multiple barriers to entry for marginalized groups. So we can think about, who has access to traditional publishing practices, or who are the gatekeepers of publishing, for example. And like I discussed throughout this tutorial, hypertext tools like Twine have cultivated a movement of support from marginalized groups and game developers who are often excluded from the very masculinist and white spaces of hypertext development. So literary hypertext has been taken up in game studies as a platform that flows open access for marginalized communities. And I began to wonder how this access could translate for my participant population, which is women and non-binary folks with hyperandrogenism. And I wanted to know how they could use Twine to write and publish illness narratives. So hyperandrogenism, for anyone who isn't familiar, is a medical condition characterized by excessive levels of male hormones, such as testosterone, which, when identified in the female body, are associated with masculinizing symptoms like excess body and facial hair, male pattern baldness, infertility, elevated sex drive, increased muscle mass, and absence of menstrual bleeding. So hyperandrogenism has actually been weaponized as a justification to call into question which bodily signifiers and hormonal nuances quantify biological sex. So for example, you might be familiar with the ongoing battle between South African track star Caster Semenya and the International Association of Athletics Federations. So after her 2016 Olympic gold medal, Semenya was mandated by the IAAF to undergo a sex verification test. So the test indicated that Semenya actually had elevated testosterone, and her results were made public. And from there, the IAAF mandated that Semenya had to pharmaceutically lower her natural testosterone in order to compete in the women's category for sport, which is a decision that she's actively trying to reverse. And just for context, the IAAF has never mandated men to pharmaceutically lower their natural testosterone. So medical literature describes that the aesthetic symptoms of hyperandrogenism are actually benign, yet in clinical practice, women diagnosed with hyperandrogenism are prescribed anti-androgens, or else they're advised of cosmetic solutions, including laser hair removal, medication for male pattern hair loss, and bleaching cream to restore feminine embodiment. So the research I did in my MA was around identifying how some women with hyperandrogenism, because of experiences of perceived subjugation in the medical encounter, were turning to online health forums to write about their experiences. And in these online forums, women were becoming essentially experts in their disease, and then they were sharing their expertise with other women. They were also rehearsing speeches to recite to doctors in order to be prescribed certain medications. They were writing and they were sharing poetry, and they were also sharing personal stories in these spaces. So from there, the question for me became, what's next for digital illness narratives? And my project now is turning towards the intersection of health and digital humanities, and I'm questioning what the future of illness narratives may look like. So the kinds of questions that I'm asking are, what kinds of platforms or digital tools might be used to hone in on the therapeutic aspects of the illness memoir, for example, or how can digital tools be used in ways that are effective for subjugated women to write a path to health empowerment. But ultimately, my project considers how we might code health liberation into the digital through literary hypertext technology. So my study is currently in the research phase, and this is a look at my recruitment poster. So I've recruited 10 participants, and I've engaged in screening interviews over Zoom with participants where I record diversity markers, so how participants identify themselves intersectionally. And this is in order to better connect experience told in their narratives to lived experience of identity. And participants were given a consent form to sign, which covered in detail the study procedures and information on how their data and identity would be protected throughout the study. And then participants were given a link to a 2-hour Twine writing module that they can complete in their browser at their own pace. And this is the module that I referenced in the first part of this tutorial. So I created this module using Twine to showcase to participants what kinds of capabilities Twine has. So if you have some skill in coding, like I discussed, you can incorporate sounds and images, although the tutorial that I gave was for beginners. And the module consisted of 5 parts. So we have information on hyperandrogenism, Twinery.org, storyboarding the participants' narratives, and then there was a mini Twine tutorial on how to use the interface. And then finally, the tutorial concludes with participants building their own Twine stories using the writing prompt. Describe what it is like to live in a body with hyperandrogenism. And this writing prompt was intended to bring to the forefront experience. So what is the experience of living in this body? So when a participant completes their Twine story, I interview them over Zoom about their experience using literary hypertext to write an illness narrative, and if and how it has affected their perception of their disease or their body in relation to the world. And I can't speak too much to results just yet, but they look very good. And, I think this research is very urgent for our current sociopolitical moment, because right now, more than ever, we require these very novel and socially distanced pathways to inform therapeutic approaches to treating adverse mental health related to illness. So I'm hoping that my research can contribute to that. So thank you so much for listening. This is the end of my tutorial on Twinery.org, building literary hypertexts.